Hey guys, welcome into the 14. I'm Nick Cole, and we're breaking down the betting action for all of the SEC games in Week 5. And today we're talking about the Ole Miss Rebels visiting the Alabama Crimson Tide on Saturday. This game's at 3:30 p.m. Eastern at Bryant-Denny Stadium. It'll be televised on CBS. The line for this game opened at Alabama -20. It's moved pretty drastically. It's all the way down to Alabama -14.5 as of this recording. Over-under opened at 80, and it's down to 79.5. I'm going to bring in our betting analyst, Christopher Smith. Christopher, what are you thinking about this SEC West showdown?
Yeah, that -20 was a little bit of an outlier. That was the Circa Sports opener on Sunday afternoon. There were some look-ahead lines even the week before that were started at -17 and even crept down a little bit from there. So I think Circa is a little higher on Alabama than the rest of the market. So I think the current line of -14.5 is probably around kind of what you would expect the overall market thinks right now. But before we get into the betting analysis for this game, Nick, why don't you give us Nick's news and notes and tell us what's going on around these programs?
Sure. So let's start with the weather and injuries. On Saturday night, Tuscaloosa, we're going to have the high is going to be 87, low is 70. So by kickoff, we should be looking at something in probably the upper to mid 70s and creeping down lower towards that 70 by the end of the night. No real rain in the forecast. Wind should be manageable, about 7 miles an hour is what they're projecting. So pretty clean slate there, and really not much injury news, not anything new anyway, that we should be concerned about for this game. In terms of news and notes, I'd just say let's start here. This is the matchup that everybody was anticipating, I think, last year when you got that Lane Kiffin returning to the SEC in the SEC West, playing against Nick Saban, sort of the guy who took him in and gave him a chance to rehab his image, and now he's back. And we looked at that game last year, and Alabama was by far the best team in college football last year with several first-round wide receivers, Mac Jones, first-round quarterback. And so even though Lane Kiffin, you could see the seeds of his offense starting to grow at Ole Miss at the time this game was played last year, you knew the Crimson Tide were eventually going to win that game, even though it was a much higher scoring game than just about anybody could have anticipated. I think it was 63-48 final score. But now that we're at year 2, and maybe it's a little bit more of a fair fight, right? Nick Saban's team is not quite as invincible as it was last season, even though they're still the number 1 team in the country. He's breaking in a lot of new players. And Lane's had a full offseason to do another year of strong recruiting, another year of implementing his offense, to trying to figure out if he has a defense. So this is, I think, sort of that matchup that we've all been looking for to see if Lane Kiffin can make some progress in the SEC West. And then the final thing I got to bring up before we get into the nitty-gritty of the betting is I think home field might actually be the difference in this game. Last year, Alabama went to Vaughn Hemingway Stadium, and Kiffin didn't have the troops. Now, Kiffin might have the troops this year to play, but they've got to go to Bryant-Denny Stadium, which, as we know, is one of the toughest places to play in college football. In fact, Alabama's won 56 of their last 58 games there, and they have the all-time winningest home record at 83.5% of the games that they've played in that stadium they've won. So when you look at an Alabama team that maybe struggled a little bit on the road against Florida and got pushed to the brink in a hostile atmosphere, being in those friendly confines might be the difference in this game where we have a couple touchdown spread. Christopher, from a betting perspective, any of that make any difference at all?
Yes, I think the home field does make at least a little bit of a difference, especially, but that's usually captured in the market pretty well with the odds makers. So I think the thing that stands out to me when you think of the Ole Miss offense, you think Lane Kiffin and you think Matt Corral. But I went and looked up the numbers for Ole Miss's snaps on offense since the beginning of last season. And under Kiffin, they're running the ball on 58% of their snaps, which is actually quite high. And they've only played 3 games this season, but 10 different Rebels players have a carry of 10 plus yards already, which is a ton. And you look at their lineup, we know Corral can run a little bit when he needs to. Jerrion Ely, who was their leading rusher last year, was 8th in the SEC in rushing last year, and he's still a good running back. But so far, redshirt freshman Henry Harris Jr. has more snaps and more yards per carry than he does. So that's pretty strong for the Ole Miss running game. Then that's not even mentioning John Rice Plumlee, who is now a slot receiver / gadget player for Ole Miss. who led the SEC in rushing 2 years ago as a redshirt freshman quarterback. And then on top of that, the top receiver at Ole Miss, Ontario Drummond, he has a run for a touchdown. So I think a lot of people need to look at the Ole Miss running game here. And part of it is that last season, Ole Miss was down a lot because of their defense. This year, Corral's ADOT, which is average depth of target, is much shorter. So he's not throwing necessarily having to bomb the ball downfield on every passing play, which I think is one of the reasons why he's throwing fewer interceptions this season. But I also think it's going to be a little bit of a different game script for Ole Miss than we saw last season. I still think they're going to run tempo. They're fourth in the country in offensive snaps per game. It's something that we saw Florida use to their advantage against Alabama's defense just a little while ago. And also, Florida was able to do that running the ball, which is what we just talked about Ole Miss being able to do very well this season. And on the other side of the ball, Ole Miss is running a very different defense this year. They're running more of the 3-down linemen, drop 8, sort of like bend but don't break, a little bit like the Sam Pittman defense at Arkansas, where you try to keep everything in front of you and don't give up big plays. And, we saw Alabama's offensive line is not nearly as good as it was last season. I think Pro Football Focus has them 70th in run blocking and 73rd in pass blocking. And Bryce Young, although he did hit a few deep balls against Southern Miss, his average depth of target is 107th out of 141 quarterbacks with 50-plus dropbacks. So it's very hard to run play action and go deep with vertical route concepts when your quarterback is constantly under pressure. So, Alabama, I expect them to try to run the ball more and take advantage of their good tight ends and throw underneath more and try to keep their defense off the field, take their time. But if they do have success underneath, then I think the Ole Miss defense is more susceptible on the back end. And if they do run the ball effectively, look for Jamison Williams in the second half, maybe to hit some play action passes deep. So, Nick, it looks like I gained a lot of games on you last week. Now I'm up on you just by one game on the overall SEC picture and by a few more than that on our best bets. But who are you taking in this game, and do you think you're going to get a game back on me here?
Yeah, you had to mention what a poor week I had last week, which honestly, I was 7-9, not terrible. You actually, credit to you for a great week with 11-5 last week. So see if I can catch back up to you this week. I'm going to say I like Ole Miss plus 14.5. And that's because I think that I don't know that I necessarily think that they're going to beat Alabama at Bryant-Denny Stadium. I'm not sure that Lane Kiffin seems quite there yet, but I do think this is ripe for a backdoor cover in a game that should have points. So as long as Kiffin can keep it within 2 scores, I feel pretty good there. And then on the over-under, I looked at last year's game. It was 111 points scored. So even though that 79.5 looks like a huge number, my affinity for Lane Kiffin overs has been well documented on this show this season, and I'm just going to stay with it, even though I'm willing to admit that this game will not come anywhere near 111 points. But I'm hoping that some late scores, some pressing the issue from Lane Kiffin will get us over 79.5. How about yourself?
Well, I've been on record, and I wrote a nail.com article a few weeks ago saying that this Ole Miss game is by far Alabama's toughest test the rest of the regular season. I think more than Texas A&M, more than Arkansas, more than Auburn, more than LSU. And so I do think Ole Miss has a chance to really keep this game competitive. So I took them plus 14.5. I like them at anything over 14. But honestly, I like under 79.5 even better than I like the side. I just think the game script this year is going to be completely different. I think Ole Miss trusts its defense more, and Ole Miss is actually more of a stronger running team this year, even though Corral can pass and they have a good passing offense. I also think Alabama's defense will be more prepared for the tempo, won't get caught off guard as much. And also think on the Alabama side, their offense will play more of a pro-style game, try to be more physical, try to run some clock, and try to bully Ole Miss around a little bit. So I don't think it'll be the same game script we saw last year. So I'm going under 79.5 and plus 14.5. But for Nick Cole, I'm Christopher Smith for the 14, and we'll talk to you next week.